Egypt and the north is northern Egypt, but who knows. So, today we're going to be picking back up with our study of the Exodus. I was hoping to conclude everything up until Exodus 1 last week, but we ran out of time, so we're going to pick up just a little bit of history. I think it's important to see some of the points from the historical record leading up to verse 1 of chapter 1 of Exodus. So, I'm going to begin in chapter 1 of Exodus, and we're going to read the prologue there. So verses 1 through 7. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So, you say, well, okay, that's great. It's a nice little introduction. But I think it's important as we're doing a historical survey. So anybody that still has the handout, and I think I actually still have a few left up here. Anybody doesn't have one. We're effectively, let's see, okay, so where we concluded last week was the conclusion of the 12th dynasty. It's coincidental or providential that the last pharaoh of the 12th dynasty dies in the same year that Joseph dies, according to the dating. And that effectively ended the 12th dynasty of Egypt. The 13th dynasty, okay, arises as a successor dynasty out of Memphis, but they weren't a very strong dynasty. Most likely either a half-son, or the son of a daughter or son of a sister. Somebody who wasn't in direct line of succession, either a high-ranking general, takes the throne, creates the 13th dynasty. Now, the 13th dynasty continued to rule from Memphis, but their rule begins to weaken. So you can see in the dates, you have 1803, which is the end. The last ruler of the 12th dynasty was actually the last queen who held on for 3 more years and then passed away herself. So you have 1803 to 1639. But if you look down at the 14th dynasty, you have 1725 to 1650. So there's overlap. And this is where we go from, again, having a united kingdom of Egypt to having regional pharaohs. So we know the 13th dynasty continues to rule from Memphis, at least until the point in 1639. Okay, but the 14th dynasty, which is an interesting one, okay, they're ruling from Avaris up here in the Delta. Now, what's interesting about the 14th dynasty is they're not Egyptian. They're not Egyptians at all. They're foreign pharaohs. We know that because the tombs in Avaris have Canaanite names. All the pharaohs have Canaanite names, and there's Canaanite gods inscribed in their tombs and in the temple complexes. So the 14th dynasty was not even Egyptian, hence why they're ruling this section up towards Canaan. Most likely, a Canaanite king moves this way, as Memphis was weak, and everybody knows at this time Egypt has all the good farmland because of the Nile Delta, so it's a natural progression. But we also know that the 14th dynasty was more or less limited to this. But we also know that the Hebrews had settled in Goshen, which is up here. So I find it interesting that you have the Hebrews already in Egypt here. We know the text tells us they multiplied greatly, and we know that from Exodus because there were numbering in the millions when they decided to leave. But I find it interesting that you have a Canaanite, potentially cousin line, ruling from Avaris. Now, it could have been one of the more distant cousin lines. It could have been an Ishmaelite. It could have been, one of the various lines of Esau. There's been a few family offshoots. But the point is, they're much closer culturally than they would be to the Egyptians. We don't know. There's no specific mention of the Hebrews there from the 14th dynasty either. But the likelihood is that if you already have people who've been dwelling in Canaan, living here as the Hebrews, and then a Canaanite king comes in, they're probably at least familiar with the sons of Jacob. I mean, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived in Canaan as effectively foreign sheiks with a massive entourage. dealing with multiple lines of kings, multiple kingdoms or city-states in Canaan. So you're likely to have some form of communication going on here. And if you look at the dating, the 14th dynasty concludes in 1650 when the 15th dynasty arises. Now, the 15th dynasty picks up in 1650, also ruling from Avaris. Now, this is the famed or infamous Hyksos dynasty of Egypt. Now, the Hyksos people were also not Egyptian. So you now have had these ruling from Avaris up here in the north that are non-native Egyptians, with Memphis attempting to hang on, okay, which being the regional power remnant, if you will, of the 12th and 13th dynasty. Okay, you've got powerhouse here, Memphis, but in the south something else is happening, and we're going to look at that. But from Avaris, the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos pharaohs were the ones who truly brought in mass military horses and chariots into Egypt. Before this point, horses were incredibly expensive. Okay, there's not a lot of pasture land available to put a bunch of animals out there that you can't eat. Okay, the land is good in Egypt, but it's fairly limited to the delta and the region around the Nile. But with the increase in the grain production, as well as the trade routes, and the Hyksos being of Canaanite descent, somewhere over here, Canaanite, even possibly farther back, ancient Near Eastern, we're not real sure where they come from, they just sort of appear. But given that you already have the Hebrews here for 100-ish to 200 years, you have the 14th dynasty, a known Canaanite line, and then you have an additional non-Egyptian bloodline coming in. They're sort of like, hey, join the club. You've got a real lack of power of traditional Egyptian politics in the north. Now, the Hyksos dynasty comes in militarily with chariots. They come in with footmen. They actually were recruiting Nubian footmen down here in the south to attack from the south. So for 100 years, the Hyksos pharaohs basically, they take over Memphis and rule. So the Hyksos pharaohs effectively move from Avaris in 100 years, rule all of the delta, and rule Memphis, and effectively rule all of northern Egypt. And that's important because they continued to oppress and attack the southern half of the kingdom. And that's, the 16th dynasty, which picks up in 1649, so the same, with like a year difference from the Hyksos coming to power, a traditional Egyptian bloodline arises out of Thebes. Now, up until this point, Thebes has sort of been left desolate for the last 200 years since the ancient kingdom. There's people there, there's merchants there, but the royal house has been ruling from Memphis. Well, the 16th dynasty, effectively being a line of pure-blood Egyptian kings, a line that traces themselves back around the invaders, if you will. Okay, they arise in the south and declare, hey, we're the real pharaoh of Egypt. So the Hyksos kings in the north and the 16th dynasty Egyptian kings in the south go to war for 100 years. So everybody in the north effectively was under this foreign occupation, regardless of bloodline, regardless of ethnicity. But again, it's more of a Canaanite influence. In the south, you have pure-blooded, traditional Egyptians. And that's incredibly important to see that set up because something happens towards the end of this original 100 Years' War, if you will, that sets us up for the book of Exodus. So with that in mind, you have the 16th dynasty ruling till 1582. In 1585, the 17th dynasty also rises in the south. It's effectively a continuation, so you still have pure-blooded kings. And then something happens in 1549. Now this is 100 years after all this conflict. The 18th dynasty, a pharaoh by the name of Ahmosis I comes to power. So he's ruling from Thebes. Now his grandfather had effectively beaten back the Hyksos from the borderlands. So they're back up in the delta. But let's see if I can pronounce it right. Ahmosis I comes to power. He effectively consolidates power and launches a major offensive to drive out the remaining Hyksos, and he does. So it's very interesting that after 100 years of direct conflict between Canaanite or Semitic peoples in power and pure-blooded Egyptians, that when a new pharaoh arises, a pure-blooded Egyptian pharaoh arises in Thebes, drives out the Hyksos invading, foreign occupation, okay, and then all of a sudden they realize, hey, there's like 1.5 million of these Hebrew people sitting here, who are like cousins to the guys we just kicked out. They might not have been directly involved in the Hyksos rule, but, they're closer than we are. So it's sort of, from the historical record, we can see this is the political landscape at the beginning of the book of Exodus. You've got a new nationalist pharaoh trying to reestablish control over the entirety of the kingdom. It's been like 250 years since his ancestors ruled all of the kingdom. You've had foreign occupation over much of the northern half. Along with that, during this foreign occupation, this random tribe of Semitic herdsmen show up and take over all the good land. It's not that it's not comical, but in one sense it's it shows us how real it is, because these are the kinds of things that happen in real life. People show up, people take over. But it also, I think, sets us up for the narrative in the book of Exodus. Because effectively what Moses I does is he conquers the north, but in that process, I'm going to make the case, enslaves the Hebrews. Because a common misconception is that the Hebrews were slaves for the full 430 years. It's not actually likely at all, as they were prosperous and the land filled with them. They were likely living quite well as nobles in the northern kingdom. Particularly to themselves. But regardless, they go from being semi-autonomous to even incorporated into the government system to having effectively to them, foreign king from the south taking over, and suddenly this makes sense when you get Pharaoh's monologue on the people. So, in verse 8, now there arose a new king who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So right there, in Pharaoh's own description, you can see how it, even without having specific record in the historical record to them being there, you can see from Pharaoh's words how this wasn't just some random family group. They were considered a threat. There was enough of them. They were fairly prosperous. Even at the time of the Exodus, they may have been enslaved. It still took them a while to get all the animals out of Egypt. Pharaoh's like, you can go out and worship, after one of the plagues, but you got to leave your animals here. And Moses is like, no, that's not going to work. We have to have them for sacrifice. But when they do finally leave, it's a massive entourage. So even in slavery and oppression, the people were still, very well to do, if you will, in terms of livestock, in terms of animals, in terms of the things that they typically would have had. So even under the harsh slavery, the Lord's continuing to bless them. So, verse 11, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities in Pithom and Ramses, and they were more. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So we can see, both from the text, the narrative playing out, and we can see the historical backing for what's going on. So, that, I think, concludes the initial handout that I had given out to you guys. And I will attempt to print one up for next week with some new details. I'm going to begin with my master copy here. Okay. So some of the historical note of the 18th dynasty. We've seen the text, we've seen what's been going before, some specific notes. In 1549, the 18th dynasty is generally, according to historians, referred to as the Tutmosid dynasty. And if it sounds strikingly familiar, there's a reason. It's also one of the dating points I would be using. But the reason is there were many pharaohs named Tutmosis. Yes, I know. Yeah, it's a good name. It actually means drawn of Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom. But the Moses, if you're getting any hints there, is the drawn part in the lingual structure. So the pharaonic names, the royal household, as many dynasties did, they mirrored their line after one of their gods. Okay, so you have, some of the later ones in particular. It actually starts here. You have Tutmosis, the Tutmoisian dynasty, is after Thoth, the god of knowledge. Dynasty, after Ra, the god of the sun. You have the Seti dynasty, after Set, the god of the desert. So you see this tradition that the Egyptian kings are naming their family lines after whichever patron god they're particularly following. Names are incredibly important. So, basically, Ahmosis I was the last brother, or the youngest brother of the last pharaoh of the 17th dynasty. As I said, his grandfather had achieved victories, but not complete. His father was sort of a pushover. His older brother died somehow. So basically, he's arising, hey, I want to finish the job. So he's got a chip on his shoulder.
He's the grandson?
Ahmosis I is the grandson of one of the 17th dynasty pharaohs that began the pushback against the Hyksos. So his entire life, his father's life, they've been at war with these northern foreigners. Okay, so that's the mindset here. And he was the first southern pharaoh to successfully reunite the kingdom under his rule and push the Hyksos out. So, okay, so that happens, and then in 1524, so I will attempt to print out a linear chart just so you guys have one, because these dates, there's quite a few of them, but they are important because they show us where certain things may be happening. Pharaoh Ahmosis I, 1549, he begins the 18th dynasty. He reigns until 1520. We don't know if it was his son or if a nephew or some other connection that the king's text doesn't tell us, but you do have Amenhotep the first who comes to the throne in 1524. Now, he is the first pharaoh to ascend to a unified throne in nearly 3 centuries. He also has inherited his predecessor's dislike of northern folk, of foreigners, and the caution there against these Hebrew people. So, let's see here. Sorry, I'm actually pushing past my handout chart, so I have to weave it together for you guys. So, verse 15 of Exodus 1. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? Then the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So we see there that you have the transition in verse Joseph all the way at the end of chapter 1 to the Pharaoh committing mass infanticide in the Nile. Now, in the text, it doesn't specifically tell us whether it's the same Pharaoh or different pharaohs, as Moses is giving us the redemptive narrative within the history. It doesn't really matter, but we know historically that the first Pharaoh would have most likely have been Moses the first, and the second Pharaoh, in this case, would have likely been Amenhotep the first. So you have a escalation, if you will. They're not just oppressed. Yes.
So I think it's sick, but what he's doing with the midwives is, he's asking them to kill the child as it's being born, the children as they're being born, but do it in a way that, oh no, there's a problem, there's a mistake,
right.
Is doing her honest duty. So the Pharaoh's commanding the midwives to engage in dishonesty and murder at the same time. And so they reply with dishonesty to the Pharaoh, so it's sort of ironic there.
Right.
And then, of course, the next Pharaoh or the same Pharaoh, whichever one, doubles down and says,
right.
Okay, kill them even if they're born.
Yeah.
But at first, it's trying to commit this mass murder under the guise of medical care.
Right.
Yeah.
And where have we heard that before? Virginia.
Why did they want the girls to live?
Because girls make more people, which doesn't totally make sense. But
yeah, it doesn't.
They cannot breed them.
That's part of it. You can effectively absorb and eliminate a bloodline. Various reasons. I mean, you still need house servants. You still need domestic help. So, yes, Andy.
I just had a question on. I don't see where. I was wondering where you got the medical angle.
The midwives are medical officers that are helping deliver the babies. So
I know that. But where's the thing that they're needing to be killed because of health reasons? Was that your comment?
Yeah, well, so they're being born. They're in the act of being born, and so they're not going to go in and say, "Hey, I'm here to kill your baby." They're going in, and as the baby's delivering, they're supposed to they're
supposed to kill.
Yeah, they're supposed to kill them, but they're doing it in a way that
they're
on the radar.
I had an observation, and this might not be completely
It's okay.
on board, but
Observations are good.
so what I've noticed throughout the scripture is the only time that dishonesty seems to be praised and rewarded is in effect to save a human life. Like,
yeah, and it's
not okay to lie, but every
right.
time that someone does so to save someone else.
Yeah, I mean, in effect, it's not that the Lord changes his standard. So he's not rewarding their dishonesty. He's rewarding their saving and not committing murder. They're saving the children. Now, technically, there could be some truth into it. Clearly, the Hebrews were outproducing the Egyptians anyways. So there's probably some vigor involved. But I think the emphasis there is not necessarily that we should zone in. I mean, I see what you're saying. Yes, there is that aspect, but I think more importantly, is they're standing up for what they believe is right, and they're not going to kill these children, and then later the Lord rewards them with their family. Now, it is interesting in the text that part is included. We just sort of assume, what's the big deal? The Lord gave them families, but within the context, there were certain roles in society that the individuals that filled them did not marry. Okay. One of them, for the ladies, is midwives. Literally comes later on in English, but even within the context of throughout much of history, you had women who never married, and effectively their entire life was caring for other people's kids from birth till death. It was the female servant class, if you will. So they're there to assist in the birth. They're there to assist in the upbringing of the children, the nurses, as the kids are, especially to the nobility. Because noble women almost never take care of their own kids. They pawn them off on the nurse, and we're going to see that. So throughout much of ancient history, even up until probably the Renaissance and a little after, there were certain roles that if you were a midwife, no guy is going to want to marry you. Like, it's almost like, it's not that they're stuck in it, but there's a bit of a taboo associated with it. It's almost like, okay, you're in that position. And it was foreign to our modern Western, everything goes. But within many of these cultures, there were uncrossable lines.
Was that because of the blood?
Partially, especially in the Egyptian culture, where cleanliness was above their godliness. That's probably a big part of it. Because you see that actually in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, you do have this aspect of the uncleanness. And honestly, we don't know that in this case, but just as there were court eunuchs that were solidified into their jobs, it wasn't uncommon to see sterilization and different practices being done on the female servants throughout much of history. Because if you want to keep them a servant, the best way to do is make sure they don't have any kids to escape for. Again, it's foreign to us, but when you think about it, and that's part, I think, of what Pharaoh's doing here. If you kill the future, then they're okay in the present to be subjugated. Not only was he trying to not make sure they didn't raise an army, but you're demoralizing them. And you see that throughout history with servants. It's just a dark part of that we sort of don't like to talk about. But I think that could be part of it. The text doesn't say, but if something like that had have happened, then the Lord is above and beyond blessing them miraculously and restoring that which was taken for their, So you got all of these aspects, but the point there is they're faithful before Yahweh, and he rewards them by saving the children with their own families, which within the culture they likely wouldn't have been able to have. So, any other observations on that point or any others? Let's just keep working with the text. Chapter 2. Now, a man from the house of Levi took as his wife a Levite woman. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took him up in a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While the young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman and took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from among the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So, we now have both a historical reference and a textual groundwork for what is about to unfold, and arguably what would make a really good Netflix show. Except for they can't do it right, and they don't need to elaborate. It's good enough as written. But we have Pharaoh Amenhotep the first, wrong page. Sorry, Amenhotep the first. Okay, reigning, declaring the infanticide of the Hebrew children. You have specifically mentioned a man of Levi marrying a woman of Levi. Now that is important. one, it's a reference to this line can be directly traced back to Levi, the son of Jacob, entering into Egypt. So you have pedigree. Specifically, also, you have purity going forward. So there can be no question. So we know Moses in this case, but we also see his sister, and later we'll see his brother. Therefore, his brother and sister are also Levi cross Levi. Very important later on for the house of Aaron. So you see that in there. And then you see some very, very wise and positively craftily actions taken here. Now, in faith, Moses' mother takes him to the river, puts him in a basket sealed with pitch or tar or sealant, and puts him there. Now, I know in the Disney movies they like to show him floating down the river, hippopotamuses trying to eat him, that sort of thing. Likely, well, they actually have that in Prince of Egypt. The likelihood is if you were a wise Hebrew woman living, mind you, in Thebes at this point, because this is the reigning capital of this 18th dynasty, and you wanted to protect your son, you're likely going to go to the palace and put it in the reeds by the palace, because that's going to give you your best chances, because princesses don't go out in the marshes. So, one thing from the text, when they came down to bathe. Now, this again hints on the Egyptian cleanliness issue. The Egyptian nobles would bathe 2 to 3 times a day. And drawing water was annoying, so what they would do is the royal palace in Thebes, and we're logically where and basically had a freshwater swimming pool for bathing, recreation for the royal palace. There was still plants, there was still reeds, there was still fish, but it was a safe zone. No hippopotami. Because they're equally dangerous to adults as they are to babies. So picture that, she's in wisdom, in the Lord's favor, putting Moses where he has the best opportunity to start with. Now, I think this can teach us not that the Lord helps those who help themselves, because that's the wrong approach. But it is that as people of the Lord, we're not to do dumb stuff. We should use the wisdom the Lord gives us, make discernment calls, and if we're attempting something for the Lord, we should do it well. Moses' mother took it to save him, making a basket, coating it, putting it in an ideal spot, and then sending his sister to watch over it, knowing that something was going to happen. Again, all of these things indicate in the text, Moses' family likely lived near and or worked near the royal palace, because they would have had to have known, in most likelihood, that the princess or one of the royal household was probably going to come down. Otherwise, Moses' mother just delayed Pharaoh's command. So, we see that. We then see Moses' sister, very wisely, securing for Moses his own mother to nurse him and raise him and get paid for it. Who wouldn't want that job, right? Get paid to take care of your own baby. So, from the text, we see the wisdom there of the Lord's people, but we also can see, historically, Amenhotep expanded the reign of Egypt during this time, and very specifically, and I've got some notes at home that I didn't bring that I want to continue working on some of the historical, so yes.
I was just going to say, even with, the best of hopes, what would it be like to build a basket and put your infant in
3-month-old in the water.
And know that, maybe someone will find him and have mercy, but maybe someone will find him and say, look, an infant under 2 years old, let's kill it.
Right.
It's a Hebrew after all. So, and then what's Miriam supposed to do? Like go and stop anybody?
Exactly.
She could just come back and report.
Right.
Man.
Yeah, exactly. It's on one hand, doing the best you can, but also there's a huge amount of faith that Moses' mother is putting in there, in the Lord and specifically in the whole operation, because, like Philip said, there's a lot of uncertainty. So I actually want to, we're going to stop here. Any questions? I've got some other notes that I want to have for next lesson that will begin to flesh out some of these interrelations within the historical narrative as well. So, questions, comments?
I thought it was interesting. I mean, I really hadn't heard about the nobles bathing 3 times and then the pool. I mean, I always just assumed that I wouldn't have an argument about that. I mean, I never had talked to anyone who wasn't a believer and said, well, that's just his little story, and how does it make any evidence for it to actually be successful? It's a myth, you know,
Right.
everything. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the archaeologists are pretty sure where the royal palace from the 18th dynasty sits. I mean, it could be one or the other, but the point is, throughout Egypt, most of the palaces of the kings and the nobles all sat on a waterway. For 2 reasons. One, they needed to bathe, they needed fresh water, they needed food. They also had to get the royal yacht in. Very important. In Egypt, if you wanted to go from here to here, there's only one way to do it, and it's up and down the Nile. The Nile was the life artery of Egypt. So when we think of things as interstates and roads, sort of scroll that back, and when looking at the text, remember every piece of commerce, every personnel transport, every important dignitary, they went on the water. So just take that away, as the Nile is incredibly important to Egypt. So, any other questions, comments? If not,
Which way does the river flow?
the water actually flows north. Because, as I mentioned in the first lesson, and I'll cover it again, southern Egypt is Upper Egypt. Because the elevation in the south of Egypt is into the mountain ranges of Nubia and Libya. So the water is actually flowing downhill north to the Mediterranean, much the same way that the New River flows north into Virginia. So the geography and the orientation can sort of mess with your head at times, but just keep that in mind. So it would have been flowing that way. Any other questions? If not, I'll pray for us and then we will be dismissed. Lord, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the written record that you have left us, and how accurate it is both for salvation and for historical learning, and how also you allow for the people of earth to write down histories that can prove your glories, and how, as we will see, your name was to be glorified. Lord, we thank you for this class and for those in it. We ask for your blessing on the coming